you can almost treat this as an internship in a sense. The disciples had an internship with the best teacher that ever lived. It was basic on-the-job training. They didn't go to seminary. They were there in the middle of it. And if you go a little bit farther, we're not going to get there tonight, but if you go a little bit into chapter 10 in Matthew, you see the sending that Jesus does with his disciples. But tonight we are going to again focus on the individuals, the 12 apostles. Everybody remembers who they are, right? Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, who is also known as Thaddeus. Then you have Simon the Zealot, and then Judas Iscariot. In verse 5 in Matthew 10, these 12 Jesus sent forth. And if you go to verse 6, it says, he told them to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then verse 7 says that as you go, preach the kingdom. So these were the workers, these are the associates, the ambassadors, if you will, of the king himself. Now, I kind of created a little play on words here with this. I know those of you last time with me, we did a study of Matthew, which presented Christ as the king. And again, I'm using a little play on words. We're going to call them all the king's men. We're not talking about Humpty Dumpty. We're just focusing on those men. And so, last time, we see noted their leader obviously is who? Peter. It says that in verse 2. The first, Simon, who is called Peter. Now, he is not, get this, he is not the first one that's been called. Did you know that? The first one called was John, and associated with him, Andrew, in that initial encounter in John chapter 1, if you go there. Peter was not the first one called, but he is first in this sense. It is the same word used in the statement by Paul when he says, I am the chief of sinners. It means the foremost one, okay? The primary one or the chief one. So when you refer to Peter, you always see him at the front of the list. He was the leader. He's always out front. Sometimes he spoke before he acted, or sometimes he acted before he spoke. Last time we studied Peter and his leadership ability and how the Lord refined and developed Peter into a what? Leader, right? Not just any leader, but a leader that was useful, okay? We have a lot of people that are willing to take a microphone, that are willing to accept a position, that like the authority, that like to be out front, they like the attention, but that does not qualify them to lead. Okay, there's a process, as we discussed last time, and it requires, as we discussed, a lot of what? What did Jesus have to do to Peter all the time? When he called him Simon, what was he doing? Rebuking him. When he called him Peter, what was he doing? Encouraging him. And we see Simon a lot. So, as we go through this, I want to kind of have this lingering question in your mind, if you will. And I want you to keep asking the question as we go through these names. What kind of people can God use? Okay? What kind? That's really the heart of this study. That's the heart of the issue that we're really focusing on. What kind of people can God use in his ministry? What kind of people can literally change the world, preach the gospel of the kingdom so that souls are saved? What kind of people does God ordain for his purposes? Now, usually when we think about Peter, Andrew, James, John, now, we have this kind of stained glass image, right? You have this sainthood, if you will, view of these men, people who are on basically a different playing field than us. So when we think about Peter, Andrew, James, and John, we kind of think them elevated in a sense compared to ourselves. All right? Now, just to give you a heads up, at this time, they were likely in their 20s, and they were stupid, arrogant, ambitious, like every 20-year-old man. All right? So they're no different than anybody else, okay? Just to keep that in mind. But we have made them out, in a sense, especially in Christian circles as they are elevated. And then, even to make matters worse, we apply the term sainthood, like St. Paul, and we even name cities after them. Or we'll have St. Peter, or we'll have St. Andrews, St. James. And these are common names for cities, by the way. Jamestown, whatever. They are no more than regular people. Okay, they're not elevated. By the way, the name John is one of the most common names in the English language. Okay? Peter, Andrew, same thing. We have cathedrals named after these individuals, and we think of these particular four as something other than ourselves. Almost like in a different dimension or time, different time, different space, whatever you want to call it, in another world. They have this aura about them, or we can apply that same ideology to current people. We'll see somebody on television, or we'll see somebody that's got a large following, and we think that God's really using them. Well, they're no different than anyone else. Everybody is gifted, and everyone is called by God. And to be honest, we really shouldn't have that terminology. And obviously, it did not come out of the Protestant movement, but it's still there. And we need to be careful about that. They are very common, somebody say common men with a very uncommon calling, okay? Very much like we are. Now, they demonstrate to us the kind of people that God can use. So I hope you can find yourself among them. Now, last time we learned that God uses people like Simon. They're impulsive, they're dynamic, they're strong, they're initiators, they're bold, who very often sometimes talk a better game than they play. They're dynamic, and he uses those kinds of people. We see evidence of that. But let's meet the second on the list, Andrew. This is Peter's brother. Could you imagine being Andrew? I'm the brother of this guy, Peter. So I'm second fiddle to this guy all the time. All right? By the way, Andrew's name means manly, if you needed to know that. Now, Andrew also was a native of Bethesda, that little village in Galilee. And he, like his brother, was a fisherman. In fact, Matthew chapter 4, it says he was down at the sea when Jesus came along. Now, guess what? He had already met Jesus. He had already believed in Jesus. This is interesting. He had already affirmed him as the Messiah. But after going back to his fishing, now the Lord appears again to him at the shore and calls him permanently to follow him. When did he meet him prior? Do you know? There can only be one other time. The donkey. With John the Baptist. Okay. He was often considered to be an earlier disciple of John the Baptist as well. So that's a little bit of information there. So he already knew him. He already accepted him because he saw what happened at his baptism. So prior to coming to follow Jesus, he had been what we would call a pious Jew, okay? In other words, a godly Jew. He was a God-fearing Jew. And again, like I said, he had also been a disciple of John the Baptist. In fact, again, it was John the Baptist's message who changed his life. Because in John chapter 1, it says, John the Baptist saw Jesus, and he said, "Behold the Lamb of God." And Andrew was there that day, along with John, also a fisherman. People believe they were acquaintances somehow. It doesn't say exactly how, but they were there. And he heard John the Baptist say that, and they followed after Jesus immediately. Isn't that interesting? But here we see Jesus turned and said to them, "What seek ye?" And they replied, "Where do you dwell?" And they went where Jesus dwelt. And they spent the entire day with him, and those hours were critical in his spiritual journey. Now, Peter and Andrew lived together. And you have to understand this. Andrew finds him first, and guess what he does? He goes straight to Peter, and he says, "We have found the Messiah." All right? We have found him. It says in Mark chapter 1, verse 29, and no doubt I believe they shared everything. And so Andrew comes, shares with his brother Peter, "We have found him." And so from the very beginning, he becomes a part of that intimate four. In fact, if you study through the New Testament, it's James, Peter, and John. Peter, James, and John. Peter and James. John, Peter, and James. They're always that inner circle. And nobody's really let in or out of that little circle except except Andrew, I'm sorry. You kind of see him in and you kind of see him out, and we're going to learn why. It's kind of interesting. He was in the most intimate four, but he never quite cracked Peter, James, and John. You'll notice that periodically. But he was greatly respected. In fact, Philip, who was in group 2, it's a little less intimate with the Lord. One time had some Greeks come to him and say, "We want to see Jesus." And you know where Philip took them? To Andrew. Why? Because I guess Philip thought that if you want to get to Jesus, all you got to do is get to Andrew and he'll take you. All right? Andrew was intimate with Jesus, and Andrew was respected. But Andrew had influence everywhere else. He was like the key. This is interesting. And even though he's not part of that inner three, we see Andrew all the time. We actually see him 3 times in the Gospel of John, and all 3 times Andrew's doing the same thing. So it's easy to characterize him. The first time is in John chapter 1, verse 40. It says, "One of the 2 who heard John the Baptist speak, and that would be John and Andrew, followed him, and he was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother." And by the way, Andrew is always called Simon Peter's brother. I think maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions. But that's how he's always identified. So that means he's always with his brother. The second time we see him is in the 6th chapter of John and in the 8th and 9th verse. It says, "A vast multitude of people are gathered. Jesus is teaching. It's late in the day. The crowd is hungry. There's not enough food. And guess who brings to Jesus this little boy? Andrew." Yeah, we see it. If you want to get to Jesus, this is the guy you got to talk to. So you're kind of seeing his characteristic and his personality start to play out a little bit. And we'll get a little bit more here. The crowd is hungry. There's not enough food. Andrew brings him to Jesus. This time it's a little boy. The little boy has what? 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, it doesn't mean 5 big loaves of bread, by the way. It's like 5 little barley crackers, okay? And 2 little fish, possibly pickled fish. They were small. Something you would snack on, basically. Basically, you'd eat them with crackers, kind of like tuna fish. So he brought the little fellow with his food, and he brought him to Jesus. And I think this is interesting. I guess Andrew must have thought the Lord could make something out of this very little. Think about that process. Everybody's starving. There's close to 20,000 people, and Andrew says, "Hey, I got this boy with a little food. I'm going to take him to Jesus, see what he can do." So out of all the disciples, it's Andrew who's got a little faith here and says, I'm gonna take him over here, see what can happen. I mean, logically speaking, this ain't helping nothing. But he goes to Andrew. All right. The third time we meet him in John chapter 12, verse 20. I alluded to it a minute ago. Philip is approached by some Greeks or the Gentiles, and they want to see Jesus. And Philip tells Andrew, and together they went to Jesus, and the assumption being that they took those folks there too. So whenever you see Andrew, he is involved in finding Jesus so that Jesus can meet someone every single time, bringing people to Jesus. Now, I guess maybe he didn't think there was anybody that Jesus didn't want to see or Jesus couldn't respond to, because he was always bringing somebody. And he's characterized as one who brought men to Christ. Now, in these three incidents, if I can just sort of draw a few pictures for you, in these three incidents, several things become clear. First of all, we see Andrew's openness, okay, willingness. He knew that they were to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He knew that primarily it was the Jew first and then to the Gentile, and yet he also got the Spirit of our God because the Lord originally had revealed his messiahship to a half-breed Samaritan woman. So Andrew was never choked up by hyper-Judaism. That's why he took the Greeks. So Andrew approached the Jews and the Gentiles and brought them to Christ. That's interesting. Paul wasn't necessarily the first to reach the Gentiles. It's pretty cool. He didn't have any problem at all with bringing some Gentiles to Jesus. So we sense a little bit of openness or willingness in his heart. So there just wasn't anybody outside. There wasn't anybody that he didn't think Jesus would not want to see. Then we also see his faith. He had simple faith. Now, I don't know what he was thinking when he brought those 5 crackers and 2 fish with such a huge crowd. I don't know what he was trying to do, running around. He could have been looking for somebody that had lunch. But he must have had some kind of faith to believe that God could do something with it. After all, he's seen Jesus make wine. Why can't he make food too? And then thirdly, we see is not only his openness or willingness and his faith, but we see his humility. How do we see that? He spent his whole life being known as Simon Peter's brother. And you can believe it, by now, when he had found the Messiah, there might have been a temptation to say, man, I'm not telling Peter. He's been putting me down for years. I'm gonna ride shotgun on this one. Because you know why? This is interesting to me. Because if you're close to someone, you know their personality. This strikes me as interesting. You know, I know my brother. If he gets this and runs with it, he's a little crazy. I don't know if I should tell him or not, but he tells him because he's so excited. This is interesting. But he runs to Peter, knowing full well that as soon as Peter enters the group, he's going to run the group. He knows it. That's Peter. And Andrew will be right back where he's always been as Simon Peter's brother. But he thought more of the work to be done than who was in charge. He thought more of the cause of the kingdom than he did his personal and petty problems. Sad to say, but there are some people who won't play in the band unless they can beat the big drum. Some people don't want to be a part of the church unless they can hold the microphone. Some people don't want to be part of the church unless they're out front leading, unless they're doing this. They're not willing to serve. They're not willing to do what's necessary. But God needs those people. You weren't getting to Jesus unless Andrew was around. He thought more of the kingdom of God than he did himself. James and John, we'll get to them here in just a minute. They had that problem. We'll see in a minute. They like that shine. Similar to Peter, but not Andrew. Andrew's not fighting about who's going to get the glory in the kingdom. He's a picture of all of those who labor in the service of the Lord in humble places, not with eye service. They're not men pleasers, but they're servants of Christ doing the will of God from the heart. That's Andrew. He has a humbler tone. Now, he could have anticipated. I don't know if you've ever known, there's a poet by the name of Christina Rossetti. He wrote this and it says, "Give me the lowest place, not that I dare ask for that lowest place, but thou hast died that I might live and share thy glory by thy side. Give me the lowest place, so if for me the lowest place is too high, then make one more low where I may sit and see my God and love him so." That's Andrew. All he cared about was the Lord and making sure everyone else knew who he was. So he's one of those rare people who's willing to take the back seat, one of those rare people who wants to be in support, one of those rare people who doesn't mind being hidden as long as the work's getting done. Okay? He's the kind of man that, honestly, if you're in a leadership role, you're dying for an Andrew. You need these people desperately. In fact, nothing gets done usually unless they're around. You can have all the ideas in the world, but unless you have people willing to put in the time and the work, it's not happening. So, let's move on down. So God uses people like that, and only God can calculate their value, because sometimes it takes an Andrew to reach Peter. Okay? There's an old Methodist preacher. I found his biography in kind of a random place online. His name was Thomas Mitchell. Have you ever heard of him? I hadn't anyway. He was similar to an Andrew. Get this. And he died. And the conference of ministers who ministered with him wrote his obituary. And this is what it said. Thomas Mitchell, an old soldier of Jesus Christ. Again, this is somebody I'd never heard. I just found his information. An old soldier of Jesus Christ, a man of slender abilities as a preacher, meaning he wasn't very good. All right? And who enjoyed only a very defective education. How's that for an obituary? Slender abilities, defective education, and yet one friend wrote this: his earnest and loving work caused him to lead many people to Christ. It's not about the abilities. It's not the education. Don't think I've got to get a seminary degree in order to share the gospel. That's not what it's about. That's his official record, by the way. Let me skip on down a little bit. So now we're going to come to y'all like Andrew? If you haven't known much information about Andrew, hopefully you have a little bit now. So we're going to move on to the third name in that first group, and we get to James. James, the son of Zebedee. Now, in 2 lists out of the 4 lists of 12, he is next to Peter. Yet we know very little about him. In fact, and note this if you're taking notes, he never appears alive in the Gospels apart from John, his brother, in any incident. In fact, they're inseparable in the Gospels. And now I believe it's important to note that he's always mentioned before John. Now, it probably not only indicates that he was older, but that he was the leader of this rather, we'll call it, dynamic duo, okay? You see them together a lot. Yes, and we'll get to that. He is what we would call the strength or the zeal. He is the passion. Now, these brothers, James and John, they were also fishermen. Their father was Zebedee. Zebedee was a fairly well-to-do man because he employed hired servants in his business. So they had a pretty good fishing business going on up there in the North Shore Sea of Galilee. And James fits into this first group because he was in the early calling, and John and Andrew were the first two, and certainly James will be so close to John, very similar to Peter and Andrew, that he worked his way into that intimacy. So, now as you look at the Bible in terms of incidents, James appears more as a silhouette than a photograph. Okay, everybody knows the difference, right? Photograph, you can see the face. Silhouette, you can see the outline. And so you have to kind of get an imagery without all the fullness of what might have happened. So the best way to look at James is to consider what the Lord named him and his brother. In Mark 3:17, Jesus gave them a nickname. Jesus gave them a name, and he called them Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Talk about a nickname. If Jesus gave you that nickname, that's something else. This wasn't from my buddies, just because I was rowdy. No, Jesus gave me that name. If James is the leader, and that is indicated by the fact he always appears first, he was a son of thunder. Now, he must have been a passionate, zealous, fervent, ambitious, aggressive type of guy. And to give you a classic reason why, in the book of Acts, get this, Herod decided to go after the church. Anybody know that? Study that? Herod decided to go after the church. And guess who the first guy he went after was? James. He chopped off his head. And everybody remembers the story. They put Peter in jail. Remember? Y'all remember the story in the book of Acts when Peter was released from jail and all the church is praying at home? Well, they had already executed James. And then Peter gets out. There's a reason for that. Peter was not as big a problem as James. Peter was ambitious, but James was almost violent in his attempt. He was the one you wanted at the back door of the church, standing guard. If you had to go out in town and stand up to the government, he's the one you want leading that pack. So if you capture James and Peter and you kill James and leave Peter alive, that says something about James. He was strong. He was zealous. He was perhaps what we would, I don't know if you know this name, but the New Testament counterpart of Jehu, who is said to come see the zeal, or see my zeal for the Lord. Then they uprooted the house of Ahab and swept all the Baal worshipers out of the land. So this guy made enemies fast. I mean, understand this. In 14 years from the time he's called to Jesus, it just takes 14 years for him to kill him. So he's roughly maybe in his 40s. Maybe. He's martyred. He's actually the first disciple to be martyred. So they got rid of him quick. He was a real problem, a thunderous individual. And so we can say that zeal is a great virtue. Zeal is important in the house of God. You need these people in your church. His zeal fed daily by the one who said, "The zeal of thine house has eaten me up." You love someone who is aggressive and who's charged up and who wants to get the job done. But very often coming along with zeal comes, guess what? A lack of wisdom. Very often. I guess we can kind of apply that to some branches of the military. You want a job done, you want somebody to run through a brick wall, you call a certain group of people. I'm not going to get into that discussion, but there's certain people you call to get that job done, right? You know who it is. Sometimes you're shooting off at the mouth, your guns are blazing before you really thought everything through. And you say, we ask the question, can God use someone like that? Well, as a matter of fact, he can. This is my personality. I don't know when to stop. Guess what? God can still use you. Several incidents stand out, and I'll show you where James is mentioned and the way he acts. In Luke 9 verse 51, it says, "It came to pass when the time was come that Jesus should be received up." It's time to move towards the Passion Week, and he has set his face to go to Jerusalem and sent messengers before his face. The messengers are going now into Samaria to prepare the way. They entered into the village of Samaria to make ready for him, and they wanted the Samaritans to hear the message. Christ was coming. The Messiah was coming. Now, they didn't receive him because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. Now, listen, Samaritans hated the Jews, all right, and Jerusalem. They had their own place of worship. Y'all remember what that is? Mount Gerizim, or Gerizim, whatever you want to call it. And they chased these messengers out. They probably threw stones at them. But when his disciples, in verse 54, we meet the sons of thunder. When his disciples, James and John, saw that, they said, "Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" They're like, "Lord, just give us the word and we will smite these people. We will call fire down just like Elijah did and we'll just kill them all." Great missionary heart. This is somebody you probably don't want on the mission field. We see somebody like Jonah, go to Nineveh. I wish God would just kill all these people. Not saying you haven't thought it, but we don't act on it. So I can identify with who James' heroes were. I believe Elijah was one of those. So Jesus turned and rebuked them, saying, "You don't know what manner of spirit you have. This is not the spirit for now. Elijah's spirit does not apply now. This is not the time for judgment or an ungodly, heretical nation. This is the time for proclamation of the kingdom or the new covenant." In other words, you are out of sync, guys. You're out of line. We're not doing that today. In other words, his basic character is leaking through. The Son of Man isn't come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. So they just went to another village. Jesus rebuked them strongly. They were hateful. They were intolerant. James has had so much zeal and so little sensitivity. I mean, what kind of evangelist would he make? Are we painting a pretty good picture of the people Jesus chose? Not quite in the sainthood realm. A lot of flaws, a lot of problems. And yet, I have to admit, there's in my perspective, there's a touch of nobility in it. And I'm glad that he got mad when the Lord was dishonored. You know why? How often do we hear the Lord's name taken in vain, dishonored? How often do we hear the Lord slandered in our own time, and it does not even affect us? We don't bat an eye. We need people like this. Because when we have people like this, we have others that can go behind them. That's important. I like the zeal there. I would hate to have seen him pass without any reaction at all, because he was zealous, he was explosive, he was fervent, passionate. He didn't just sit and watch it happen. Another incident in Matthew chapter 20. Very often, zealous people are also ambitious people. They're very goal-oriented, task-oriented. Okay? It's a little bit different. I mean, you can kind of interchange them with the leader, but it's not always the case. So when you're task-oriented, it doesn't always mean you're the leader, but you like a goal. You shoot for something. Matthew 20. And this is the incident that we referenced to the disciples last time, but just as a reminder. They came to him, the mother of Zebedee's children, with her sons. Get this for a minute. James and John, the sons of thunder, bring their mom to try to talk Jesus into giving them favor. Okay? Now, what would Peter do? He just come point blank and ask. Now, he would just say stuff without intending. But these two, they saw Peter all the time. They're like, I'm going to try a different approach. They had the same agenda. We can bash Peter all day, but they had the same agenda. We're just going to get our mom. Maybe he'll be nicer to her. They try. Here comes their mom dragging them on her skirt tails. And she says to the Lord, "Grant these that my two sons may sit, the one on the right hand and one on the left, in thy kingdom." In other words, would you please put my boys on the throne next to you? Now, keep in mind, they all still think of an earthly kingdom at this point. All right, they're thinking, notoriety, prestige. They're still thinking, I'm going to get something. You say, what about Peter? Listen, Peter had a lot of zeal. He also had a lot of problems. I mean, he would deny and bail out. James didn't seem to have that problem. Peter faltered here and there, but it seems as though James was a little more resolute. In fact, he was dead in 14 years. They got rid of him so fast. He didn't equivocate. He didn't compromise. And you could see his ambition. I'm going all the way for the kingdom. In fact, he was going all the way for the right hand. He had an agenda. Now, as a leader, you may be careful a little bit with these fellas. Make sure they're in the right frame of mind. And Jesus says, you don't even know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? What do they say? Sure we can. Yeah. And guess what he says? All right, you will. Verse 24, and guess who does it first? James. 14 years later, he's gone. Very quickly. Verse 24 there is the fever pitch. And the argument of all the disciples over who was going to get what in the kingdom. And they all started arguing. Jesus went into a little lecture on what the real leadership is. Remember that? They were ambitious. James was ambitious. This was a terrible thing for them to do, to arouse this spirit of, we'll call it rivalry, to clamor for the honor from God. All the disciples were doing it. It wasn't just them. Those guys at the top just spoke up. The rest of them wanted it too. And we'll get to them. They were persecutors of the Samaritans. They're ambitious, self-seeking place hunters, stalking the favor of the Lord as if he was some kind of ruler who could give them whatever they wanted, favoritism. They were, at this point, demeaning Christ and his kingdom. But James had zeal. He had great fervor. He knew the Lord's special interest in him, and he was on that inside group. He wanted a crown. Jesus gave him a cup. That's important. He wanted power. Jesus gave him servanthood. He wanted to rule. Jesus gave him a martyr's grave. Look at the one incident in the Bible where he appears alone, and that's Acts chapter 12. It says, now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. And when Herod wanted to attack the church, he went right for the main guy. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. That's who you go for first. Then he put Peter in prison. He didn't even think about Peter until he was told that it would please the Jews if he killed him as well. Think about that for a minute. James was out front. He was the one he was after. He was the son of thunder. He was filled with zeal. In fact, when you see guys like that, if they're in opposition from you, those are the ones you want to attack first. Those of anybody that's ever played sports before, you know, if you know who the best player is on the other team, you got a strategy to take them out as best you can. And vice versa. That's what you're trying to do. And that's what happened here. And it finally came to the place where James was willing to die for Christ. And both brothers drank that cup. For John, the cup was a long life of rejection and death and exile. For James, it was short. It was martyrdom. The Romans had a coin years ago, and on that coin was an ox. And on the ox was facing an altar and a plow. And under the ox it said, ready for either. And that's how it is in the service for Christ. That's how it was for the sons of thunder. There is this moment of dramatic sacrifice on the altar, and that was James. Then you have this long lifespan of John, who spent so much time on the Isle of Patmos, exiled. You see one who's willing to die. You see one who's willing to serve. That applies to those of us who serve Christ. Some are called home quicker. Some of us are called to serve longer. We have the same gift. We have the same call, but some of us have different timelines. But it doesn't mean one is greater than the other. Sometimes God just calls those he needs home, home. And there's beauty in that. There's wonder in that. Think about that for a moment. Two brothers, inseparable all the time, and now they're separated by decades and decades, years and years and years. Very different experiences. James had to learn sensitivity. He had to learn to quit his ambition, and he did, and God used him. Did you know a lack of sensitivity can destroy a ministry? There are many people who try to serve Christ, and we can become insensitive to people, to needs. We'll call it congregations, to their families, people around them. I read a story when I was putting this together. It's a Norwegian pastor. His story was very interesting, and he had this motto. His motto was all or nothing. That's a great saying. Why not? That sounds good. And I really want you to get this. All or nothing. And he went around preaching, proclaiming loudly. It says he was hurling out lightnings and screaming thunders on everybody. He was stern. He was strong. People are gonna pop up in your mind right now. Powerful. And they said that the people in this church didn't even care for him because he didn't care for them. He had the limelight. He had the stage, the prestige. He could say the right words. I'm telling you right now, as a pastor, you can be the best communicator in the world, but if you don't care for the sheep, that's a problem. You can be the best Sunday school teacher in the world, but if you don't care for your students, that's a problem. See what I'm saying? There has to be some sensitivity there, and that's what James had to learn. He wanted to advance the kingdom. He wanted to uphold the standard of God, and he was blind to everything else. It came down to his own family, and he had a little girl, and just a little tiny girl. She was sick. She was ill. And the doctor said, you must take her out of the Norwegian cold where she can come to a warmer climate so she can regain her strength, or she will die. To which he answered, all or nothing. And he stayed, and she died. And when she died, the mother was so distraught and shattered, she found no love in her husband. Hated him. Her love was that little girl. And she would sit for hours in a chair holding the clothes of the little baby. This didn't go on for many days until her husband took them all out of her hand and gave them to a poor woman in the street. But his wife had tucked underneath her little bonnet, which she kept as the last memory of her daughter, and he found that and gave that away too, and gave her a speech, all or nothing. And in months, she died of grief. We have to be careful, even as Christians. Yeah, I want to reach the world. I want to spread the gospel as far as I can, but I cannot neglect my home. I cannot neglect those people closest to me. I'm not going after people to achieve a number. Sometimes that's the best place to start, is at home. So insensitive. What kind of men does God use? What kind of women does God use? What kind of people fit into his plan? Dynamic people like Peter, leaders who can get everybody to do it, humble people like Andrew who just do it quietly behind the scenes, James who don't really need other people to do it, they just do it. They see a problem and they attack it. And you say, you mean the Lord can use all those kinds of people? You don't have to be born with a halo? No. You don't have to be on a stained glass window. We can just be us. These are very common people, but guess what? He can transform these individuals that change the world. Very simple. Finally, the last individual that we're not going to get to spend a ton of time on him this week, but other than Peter, John is the other disciple where we get the vast majority of our information. We see so much of his writings. And so I'm going to touch it as much as I can now, but we may have to revisit it. But we see him here. He intersects the story throughout the New Testament. We'll see kind of a interweaving between Paul's writings, John's writings. Then we see a few from Peter. We'll see a few from Mark, a few here and there. But you'll see a lot of interaction with John and with Paul. Okay, they're kind of interwoven into the New Testament. He wrote the Gospel of John, John 1, 2, and 3, and the book of Revelation. But I want you to have to at least have briefly see who he is. Now, when we think about John, I want you to understand this. There's been this kind of image created of John. We see, like, we have the image of the Last Supper picture. Remember, he's leaning on Jesus. That's not right. Okay? Remember, he is a son of thunder. He's the other half of the other guy. He's up there too. He's not this somewhat, and he's kind of been associated kind of effeminately. People have kind of made him out to be kind of this affectionate, loving, lovey-dovey, touchy-feely type of guy. Okay? That's not always the case. Okay? So we're gonna get to know a little bit more about him. Some people think about this meek, mild, kind of pale-skinned guy lying around, with his head on Jesus' shoulder, looking up, dove-eyed and whatever, with his little skinny arms. But if you missed it, hopefully you didn't, he is a son of thunder. He was intolerant. When he was one of the guys that said, let's burn them up. It wasn't just James, he was one too. Let's just kill them all. He was ambitious. He wanted a seat too. It wasn't just James and his mama. John was there too. He wanted a seat next to Jesus. He was zealous. He was explosive. Not quite as much as James. But John does seem to have this side to him. And we see that John lasted. He lived to nearly 100 years old. He outlived everyone. Now, it's interesting to note that the only time he appears alone by name, you know what he's doing? He's mad at somebody. Does that speak to anybody here? That's right, John. Who's he mad at? Some guy who was casting out demons in Mark chapter 9. Why was he mad? He said to Jesus, he said, there is a man casting out demons, and he's not even in our group. He's not in our church. He's doing this over there. He's not even a part of what we're doing. And guess what? He says, I forbade him to do that. I told him, listen, fella, cool it. Stop it. You're not in our group. John was what you would call a sectarian, or he was narrow-minded. Very narrow-minded. Mark chapter 9, verse 39 and 40, John says, Lord, I told them to be quiet because he wasn't in our group. That's intolerance. That was John. He was intolerant. But you know something? That became a strength in his character because he has also had a tremendous capacity for love. And you show me a man who has a great capacity for love and no sense of the truth and no limits and no guidelines and no strong convictions, and I'll show you a disaster. Hence our current church culture. When you become tolerant of every wind of doctrine and you become tolerant of every sin and you allow everything into the house of God, that becomes a problem. Then we wonder why the church acts like the world when we keep inviting them in here. Not saying that God can't save them when they get here, but the house of God is for the saints. We do the witnessing and the reaching out there, that we bring them in here. Now, again, ain't nothing wrong getting saved in here either, but it's for the saints. We don't dress up the house of God to appeal to sinners. We don't do that. God knew that the greatest source of truth in the New Testament, as far as a human author is concerned, about love would have to be a man who is also strong and uncompromising. Or his love would take him down the road of sentimentalism. Do you know what that means? I'm going to kind of unpack that for a minute. Because this is us. This is what's happening in our church culture. We try to reach the sinner where they are because we feel like we are being tolerant and we're reaching them to be loving. But if we do not point out the sin that's directly affecting them, which is offensive, by the way, then we're really not showing love. It's like if somebody's driving down the road, I see a giant pothole that's going to take their car off the side of a cliff, and I say, you just go ahead because I'm nice. They're going to die. That's the point. We warn them, hey, this is sin. This sin will lead you to hell. That's love. The other's tolerance. There's a big difference. I discipline my kids not because I don't want them, not to have fun, but I want them to understand there's danger there. If you keep going down that path, it's going to hurt you. That's love. Love is, it's almost like an action. It's not just an emotion. And so that's so important for us to understand as Christians. We cannot compromise the gospel. Period. We cannot compromise in the face of tolerance. We cannot compromise just because everybody else is doing it. Guess what? The church is literally built on in blood. All of these men were executed, by the way. All of them. Except John, who's exiled, and he dies there too. And he was boiled alive. Just throwing that out there. So that could be our path. We could be like James, hey, it's your time, and we're going. Or it could be John, where it's drawn out and we're used by God. So it's important for us to understand that when we love and we lead and we serve in the house of God, we do not compromise the truth. Period. Because we are not loving. We're loving them all the way to hell. We're tolerating all the way to hell. That's important. So you find two things that stand out in John's life, and I got a little bit we'll have to pick up, I guess. Two things, the word love and the word witness. 80 times he uses the word love. Over 70 times he uses the word witness in one form or another. He was always the witness to the truth. He was always the teacher of love. And so he is the personification of speaking the truth in love. As a leader, as a teacher, when we teach the truth uncompromising. Because when we do that, we do it in love. That is loving. The most loving thing you can do is to protect those who you are serving. He wanted to know the truth. He was a discoverer. He was a visionary. He was there with Andrew, who recognized Jesus first. It was him who God revealed in the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. That's the guy that God chose to reveal that to. He was the seer. He was the visionary, the truth seeker. The reason he was hanging around Christ so much was not kind of sloppy or sickening sentimentalism. What it was his heart literally hungered for the truth. Our heart, no matter what we're called to do, needs to hunger for the truth. We have a deep affection for Christ. He wanted to gather every word that came out of Jesus' mouth. So he became a lover, but a lover whose love was controlled by the truth. And that love was married with his zeal and his personality, that passion, that strength, fiery character. They're kind of tied together. I'm going to try to find a stopping point here because I got a little bit more to go. We'll pick back up on it next week. So John has a firm, strong character, but he has a strong desire for the truth. I'm going to tell you this. If you have a desire to teach or a desire to preach, you better have a hunger to read the Word of God. Because nobody, and me included, needs to hear my opinion. You don't need to hear from my heart. You need to hear from God's Word. So if you're studying to teach or to preach, we're not interweaving our opinions. It better be backed by the Word of God. Because if it's not, the book of James says we will be judged harsher because we interpreted the Word of God wrongly. Think about that for a moment. So if that's your calling, if you want to teach, if you want to lead, make sure you are a seeker of the truth of God. Know it.